Now, in addition to the groups that you'll be creating as you go through the day-to-day operations of your Active Directory infrastructure, there are also a number of built-in groups. There are a number of those that are available out of the box. These we've already talked about back in that last module when we were looking at the Active Directory Users and Computers console. But I want to show you here back on our machine, dc.company.pri, just once again the location where we can take a look at the different groups that exist in Active Directory. I'm going to pop up here and open up my old favorite ADUC console here, Active Directory Users and Computers, although you could use the ADAC, the Active Directory Administrative Center, if you preferred to. And if I come down here to our Users OU, we can take a look again at some of the groups that are available, in this case mostly right out of the box. Here you can see these groups that are configured as universal groups, as global groups, and as domain local groups. And if we pick any particular one of these, like domain admins, for example, we can take a look at just some of the characteristics that are associated with these groups. So the group name, the description, any email addresses, the scope of the group, the type of the group, any notes, as well as up here, the members of that group, and where this group is a member of somewhere else. And then lastly is the ability for us to assign a user or other object that is determined to be the manager of the group. So here for this domain admins group, I can click the change button and identify some user or other security principal that would be the manager of that group with all of the associated information down here. You don't see this happen too terribly often in production environments, but this can be nice if you've got certain groups that you just want to set yourself or a particular user as the person responsible for dealing with this group. Notice how if I click the change button here and identify myself as a potential manager for the group, one of the other things that I can do is identify whether or not this manager has the privileges of updating the group membership list or not. Now this says that I may be able to give a user, a particular user, that privilege so that they can add and remove members from this group. This is obviously a fairly powerful privilege, so you'll want to be careful when you check this box to make sure you only do so in situations where you trust the individual that would be managing the group. I will clear the G-Shields user from this list now just to keep our domain admins group relatively pristine at this point. Because while we're here, I want to show you also some of the organizational units that exist here in our domain as well. And very specifically, I want to show you one difference between what we think of as an organizational unit and what we think of as just an Active Directory container. And everything about that has to do with these little icons right here on the left. Notice how some of the icons here have a little, what is that, a box there in the little folder, and some of them do not. Those here that have a box next to the folder are different from those that do not because these are technically organizational units as opposed to being Active Directory containers, just purely containers. Now an organizational unit is a container, but there are some functions you can perform on an organizational unit that you cannot perform on one that is just purely a container. Now, it is for that reason that most organizations create a special organizational unit to become the location where users and computers ultimately reside, as opposed to the default containers here. Let's say, for example, I wanted to create a new organizational unit. I could do so by choosing New OU, and then I could create this organizational unit as, for example, Company Computers. When I create that OU, I have the abilities to protect the container from accidental deletion. This sets a flag on the permissions for that OU that eliminates the abilities to accidentally click and delete the entire organizational unit at once. But when I create that OU, notice how this Company Computers OU now has the little box next to it. And I can then take my servers, if I wanted to, from the default computers container and then move them over here into the Company Computers organizational unit so that I then could enjoy all the extra features and benefits that I get out of being a full organizational unit as opposed to a container. Now you may be asking, okay, well, what are those extra things? The biggest of which is the abilities to assign group policy to this container. Later on when we talk about group policy, you'll see how I can create a group policy object and then assign it to a container like this group of Company Computers. And in fact, we'll be doing that as we start creating those GPOs a little later on. Now that's the process we would go through in order to do all of this work here inside of the graphical user interface. If I needed to create, for example, groups, I could do the same thing just like I did before, choosing new group, assigning a name, and then the scope and the type associated with that group. But it's really the PowerShell pieces here that I think are just as important, if not more important, particularly for the exam. So let's actually flip back over here into our PowerShell console and take a look at the process by which we would accomplish these tasks inside of PowerShell. And in fact, before we get into actually typing in commands into our PowerShell prompt, let's take a look at just some of the basic commandlets that you got to know here that are associated with group and organizational unit management. I want to bring up first this slide that we took a look at back in that last module, which had to do with automating the creation of Active Directory accounts. And we already looked at all these commandlets that relate to creating computer and user accounts in our domain. And I bring this up because they very much mirror the same kinds of commands that we would use for automating the creation and removal of Active Directory groups. So on the group side, we can use the get AD group command to get information about a particular group, and then new and remove AD group to create a group and remove a group. We could use the add and remove AD group member commandlet to add and remove members from that group that we just created. Over on the organizational unit side, we could use get AD organizational unit to get information about an OU, and then new and remove to create or remove an OU from our domain. Fairly basic stuff here, obviously, but I wanted to bring this up to give you an idea of the mapping between how the commandlets look on the group side and the OU side in comparison with how they look on the user side and the computer side. So let's fit back here into Windows PowerShell and actually go through creating some objects here in our Active Directory domain. Let's start with a new organizational unit, similar to the company computers OU that we created, but in this case, we will do company users. So I'll choose new AD organizational unit, and let's call this company users as the new OU that we'll be creating. In this OU, we'll need to go about moving our Active Directory user accounts into the new location. We also perhaps want to create new groups in that location as well, which we could do with new AD group. Let's create a new group here for the individuals in our organization who are extremely untrusted people. We were joking about this back in the last module about our Jason account and our Don Jones account as being extremely untrusted users in our Active Directory domain. So let's create that group, and we'll call it extremely untrusted users, if I can spell it correctly. That group, extremely untrusted users, we then need to set the group scope here as a global group, as opposed to a domain local group or universal group. And then I want to set the path also on the group to the correct location here in Active Directory where we want to create the group. This path needs to be set up using LDAP language. So if I do OU equals company users, and then DC equals company, and then DC equals PRI, that should path this group into the company users organizational unit that we created just a second ago. Looks like I created everything correctly there. And let's go ahead and verify that everything is correct up here in our Active Directory Users and Computers console. I'll refresh things here in company.pri, and there is our company users OU that we created and our extremely untrusted users security group that we also just created. Let's complete the process by adding in those terrible users into this extremely untrusted users group. So add AD group member, and then extremely untrusted users as the group name. And then the two people that we want to add into this group would be our Jason user and our Don Jones user. If everything's been done correctly here, I can come back to the group and verify that the group members of this group are indeed Jason and Don. So this gives you an idea of really the simplicity of using the PowerShell commandlets here for adding and removing users from groups. And if you had to deal with the risk torture activity that is dealing around and clicking around here in the Active Directory Users and Computers console, you'll definitely appreciate using PowerShell and your fingers to accomplish the task as opposed to your wrists.